Morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to our Government Spotlight presented by your Columbus Chamber of Commerce. I'm Don DePero, the President and CEO of your chamber. I'd really like to thank all of you and especially our great chamber members who've joined us this morning. And a special shout out to all of our government relations experts, our vice presidents and lobbyists who work so hard to protect us week in and week out. Thank you all so very much. Now, our presenting sponsor, Spectrum, and I'd like to bring to you Tamara Howard, a manager of government affairs for Charter Communications. Tamara.
Thank you, Don. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tamara Howard. I am manager of government affairs for Charter Communications. As a longtime partner and supporter of the Columbus Chamber, I am thrilled to be here today to kick off today's program, virtual panel discussion on affordable housing. Affordable housing uplifts residents, it encourages social connection, reduces overcrowding, increases adjacent property values, and attracts businesses and jobs. Housing affordability is a critical factor in attracting new employers and helping existing businesses grow. Today, our panelists will highlight strategies that can improve housing across the spectrum as a way to better attract and retain workers. Charter Communications is the leading connectivity company and cable operator providing superior broadband, voice, video, and mobile services under the brand name Spectrum. We employ more than 7,200 employees and provide service to more than 1,700 communities across Ohio. We understand the importance of affordable housing and how the services we offer help to move the needle forward on this critical issue. Whether it's applying for housing, connecting with community organizers, or searching for a job, Spectrum works to ensure communities are connected to the services needed to thrive. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Des Bryant, Vice President of Government Relations for the Columbus Chamber of Commerce. Des?
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. Housing affordability is a critical factor in attracting new employers and helping existing businesses grow, like Tamara stated. This is important not only for creating jobs, but also for building the region's tax base so it can fund key services like education, public safety, parks and recreation, and environmental safeguards. If our community is to stay vibrant and economically viable, prioritizing housing affordability needs to be a community-wide effort. To address this issue, our region will require commitment, investment, and perhaps most of all, innovation. To kick off this program, I would like to introduce our moderator, Aaron Prosser, Assistant Director of Housing Strategies with the City of Columbus. Thank you to Aaron and to our panelists for joining us today. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Des, and thank you to the Chamber for hosting this important conversation. I think there are a lot of us in town that are thinking and, kind of thinking about the future of Columbus and how we're going to grow as a city, and building our housing infrastructure so that we can maintain that livability and affordability is important for all of us in the community. And before I introduce our panelists, I just want to kind of level set on what we mean when we talk about affordability. And when we talk about housing affordability, we want families and individuals in our community to not be paying more than 30% of their income on their household expenses. So that is rent and mortgage plus utilities. That is a number that allows our families to have high quality childcare, have reliable transportation, save for the purchase of a home, all the important things we have in the community. It also allows for discretionary income to spend in our local businesses, right? As we look at our community today, we have about half of the rental households in our region that earn less than $50,000 a year are paying more than 30%. So half of those renters are paying more than 30%. A quarter of them are paying more than 50%. And as we start to see the continued investment in job creation in our community that's really been led by our affordability and our livability, as we add, I think we're on track this year to look at about, for the region, 30,000 new jobs. In the last economic cycle, our region built about 2.5, for every 2.5 jobs we created, we built only one home. That is not a sustainable ratio. We need to be closer to 1.5, right? For every 1.5 jobs we bring into the region, we need to be building a house. The housing infrastructure is as important to our region as building our roadway infrastructure, our utility infrastructure. That is what we have to be focused on as a community in order to stay competitive, right? To continue to attract and retain new jobs, to be able to balance our workforce and to be able to have individuals and families to spend money in our local businesses. And so we have the privilege today, I have the privilege of moderating a panel of 3 folks that are working really hard in our community to bring that housing infrastructure into a reality for the Columbus region. And what I'm going to do first is have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then I've got some questions for them. And then at the end, we'll save some time for questions from those of you in the audience. So Brent, I'm going to have you go ahead and introduce yourself and where your role is in building our housing infrastructure.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Brent Crawford with Crawford Hoying, based here in Dublin, Ohio, and very much committed to our community and building out great neighborhoods and great properties and creating special destinations and locations for our residents here and everybody who wants to move to the Columbus area.
Thank you. And Carly, can you introduce yourself?
For sure. Hey, good morning, everybody. I am Carly Booz. I'm the Executive Director at the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. We're a nonprofit organization. Our goal is to help advance solutions that are going to address these affordable housing challenges, really through the lens of economic development and strengthening our community as a whole. I'll also note that we're a membership organization as well. That's very important for us. We want to be able to see how this housing affects our different perspectives. So we have representation from investors, from funders, from developers, from homeless shelter operators, pretty much anybody who's involved in the housing world. We want to be able to make sure we're incorporating their experiences into our work. Thanks.
Thanks, Carly. And Leah, will you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Erin. Good morning, everyone. I'm Leah Evans, President and CEO of Homeport. We are a 35-year-old affordable housing developer focused here in Central Ohio. As a nonprofit, our mission is to provide affordable homes and build strong communities. We currently have 42 properties across Franklin County and house about 7,000 people. About half of those are children. So really dedicated to housing the workforce. We found during the pandemic, many of our residents worked at schools, worked at the airport, worked in food service, worked at the grocery store. So we are housing those that were, considered essential, but it also is essential that they have somewhere to live. And that's the work we've been doing for 35 years. Thank you, Erin, for letting me be part of the conversation.
Thank you. And I'm excited to kind of dive into it. And I think, Brent, I've given you the most challenging question to kind of start out with. But as I mentioned in my intro, we're not building the housing infrastructure we need. And so can you talk a little bit in your experience about why we're not building that housing infrastructure? What are the challenges that our region's facing in getting those homes into our community to serve our population?
Absolutely. Well, it's been hard for a long time, but this probably, I would say, without question, the most difficult period in our history to build product and deliver it to the market that we can afford to build and that people can afford to rent. I think we need to step back a little bit and realize this isn't something that's obviously new. It's been decades in the making. And what are the reasons that it's been decades in the making? It's really that the whole attitude of not in my backyard as it relates to density and height are really two of the first keys that got us to where we are today. And also even in materials, certain municipalities or cities requiring X amount of brick or stone or glass on buildings in certain areas automatically is going to force a higher cost of a product, which is going to put rents at a higher level and make, in some cases, it unaffordable. And so we need to change the attitude that allows for more density and height. That's the first solution. At the end of the day, we are in it's a supply issue. It's a demand issue that exists out there, and that's not changing. As you made mention, we have far more demand than we have supply. So unless we're going to allow for additional density and height, we're not going to be able to solve that problem. It's been exacerbated by the pandemic, of course, and made much, much worse. So we talk about building affordable housing and being able to afford to build affordable housing. It's very difficult to afford to build market rate housing right now. With the supply chain issues that were created by the lockdowns, I mean, the cost of construction has just exploded upwards. Depending on where you are and the type of product and so forth, but not unusual to see 20, 30, 40% cost increases from 24 months ago. And yes, rents have risen, but now we have a rising interest rate environment. And so many of the deals that you see now that we're looking at on all fronts don't pencil very well right now, and it's difficult to make them work. And so I'm very concerned with what's happening now that we're going to see a reduction, even though the demand is there. People can't afford to build the units because it is such high risk at this moment with construction prices as they are, combined with rapidly rising interest rates. And we live in a world, in the development world, of it's a high risk business as it is. And when you combine extreme unknown factors, it makes it difficult to make commitments to build thousands of units with an uncertainty of the ability to capture the rent. And also, we understand the pressure it puts on families and individuals to know that, yes, our costs are going up, but in order to be able to get a loan, to attract capital, to be able to have it pencil out, we have to charge certain rents. Otherwise, we can't build it. And then we're in this vicious cycle of not providing enough product to the marketplace. And I think an important part of this is to understand we need all housing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Affordable housing is critical. But in a lot of cases, people are wanting to push the affordable housing, which I certainly understand and we completely agree with. But it goes not only from the bottom up, it goes from the top down. And what I mean by that is if we're not building enough Class A property in Columbus, as an example, if we're looking at 30,000 new people coming to Columbus annually, and we're building, just as an example, 15,000 housing units, the reality is I believe a large portion of those people moving to Columbus are moving into the higher end of the market. So if we don't have enough Class A or Class B apartments, it pushes the rents up, which forces people out of those units down into the B, what we would call the B class apartment, which forces rents up, which pushes people down into C class, which pushes rents up, and so on and so forth. So we need to attack it from both ends, because just saying we're going to hit it from one side is not going to solve the problem. We need housing in general, because it's just a proven fact in economics. Obviously, if we have lots of supply, prices are going to come down in all aspects of it. So long-winded answer there, but there are a lot of challenges ahead. I will say this, I think the solutions are there. Right now, the first steps immediately is density and height. We can immediately start to improve the situation, but we have to get our cities and municipalities to understand that we need that density and height to make it work.
That's really good context, Brent, and especially thinking about, housing as an ecosystem. And as we don't provide enough, even at the higher end or the market rate end, we are creating consequences for families that may not be in that Class A space, but looking at other opportunities. And Carly, I know your organization, your members are working hard to bring those units online for folks that may not be able to afford where we are as a market right now. And I talked a little bit about where we are with families that are earning less than $50,000 a year in our community, and kind of what they are experiencing as a result of this housing shortage. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of have this big picture discussion, because I think so much of what Brent said is really important. Those dynamics, being able to pencil out a deal, being able to see that pro forma balance, that's what all of this comes down to. Those are the same challenges everybody's facing. The difficulty is that affordable housing's pro forma is always going to be harder to shape. If you've only got $700, $800 a month coming in rent, the ability to make those construction numbers fit is always going to be harder. Even before the inflationary pressures, even before the interest rate environment we're seeing now, this has been a challenge for affordable housing for many generations. And the result of that is that we have 54,000 Franklin County households that are paying more than half their income towards rent or to their mortgage costs, because this is a home ownership issue as well. And that 50% threshold is so important, because there's a lot of different things that folks call it, but it's basically the life and death threshold, right? Because after you're paying more than half of your income towards your housing, you are making sacrifices. You are balancing that checkbook at the end of the month, and something's giving. And it's usually going to be food for your kids or prescription medicine for your parents. And that's a very dangerous position to be. And it's not just destabilizing for those individual households and those families going through it, but that's really destabilizing for us as a community as well. That is not a sustainable situation for anybody. So then you kind of begin to see how these different ramifications play out, right? How that original data starts to manifest in different ways. So right now, we only have 32 houses for every 100 extremely low income families who need it, a 3-to-1 deficit. We have had 30,000 evictions filed since COVID-19 began, which I think shocks everybody, because there was this wide misconception that evictions just nosedived. They did not, they kept going. And in fact, they're now outpacing where we were prior to the pandemic. And 1 in 4 Ohio renters have little or no expectation that they're going to pay rent next month, 1 in 4. So like, think about that. You know 4 renters. You've got a cousin, you've got a colleague, you've got the neighbor next door. Statistically speaking, if you know 4 renters, you know somebody who is staring down the barrel of an eviction. And that is something that's going to touch on all of us. And then I think going right back to where Brent left off, just to keep the status quo in place, right? Just to make sure that this housing crisis doesn't get any worse and that we are building towards that growth, towards that population increase. We should be putting 14,000 new houses in the ground every single year. And we are not even close. Even on our best years, we're thousands of units short of where that needs to be. So I think especially in light of Intel and Hyperion and all of these other amazing economic development advancements that are coming into the region, we really need to think about how we can do better to make sure that the housing reaction matches the economic development reaction.
Thank you, Carly. And I think that's, looking across the full spectrum of the housing ecosystem is the thing that we need to do as a community. And really thinking, Leah, I think you alluded to it at the beginning during your introduction of the folks that are living in your communities and need that housing that is not available at the market rate. Because as Brent mentioned, that construction is expensive. But Homeport really bringing homes online for those earning less than 80% of area median income, which is kind of around that 50,000. And I think just if you can talk a little bit about who your residents are, and when we bring in affordable housing, big A affordable housing into our communities, who are those folks that are coming to live in our communities?
Like how Aaron says, big A affordable housing. So that's the more traditional format. And I think where Brent started is where I'll start as well, is that one of their biggest challenges is about perception. He talked about perception of density and height and those challenges. Equally valid for the work that a group like ours does is the perception of what affordable housing means. What does that mean for a community? And the idea that that is less valuable to a community than another type of housing. And so as we think about, as Carly said, as we think about this growth across the spectrum of a community, we tend to prioritize what we think has value when you go into a zoning conversation. What's the highest and best use is a single family house on 1 acre. It is not, 50 units of, affordable housing, nor is it, as Brent described, a 6-story apartment building, a multifamily apartment building. We hold out this standard of what we value. And I think as a community, that is where we continue to be in the same conversations, battling the same battles, is that we haven't figured out how do we value the different types and spectrum of housing that we need to actually have a healthy, vibrant, strong community. So the residents that live with us are again, just the name by name. They work at the grocery store. They work in childcare. Again, we can have a whole nother conversation about how childcare is funded and how childcare workers make on average about $10 an hour. And what does that mean when you go looking for housing? But we all know how much it costs to get childcare and how important it is to a workforce. So those are the workers that we historically house. We tend to also house a large percentage of women, single female head of households, who again are the working population. They're the children and the next generation of workers, and that comes with a lot of other costs of services and other safety nets that we provide. As Carly alluded to, before the pandemic, we ran rental assistance programs, and we were very thoughtful about evictions. No, we do, even affordable housing, any kind of housing provider is still going to have eviction action when it's appropriate. But when you try to deter that and provide an opportunity for people to have housing stability. So I think one of the dovetails that you'll get to, Aaron, is the Morpsey housing study had 5 big things, and one of them was just housing stability. So if you flip what Carly was saying, that we're not building enough for the people that we have, we at least got to keep the people that are housed in housing, right? And so that work becomes equally as imperative as we continue to see the pricing pressures and the displacement that can happen from that eviction profile. So the housing stability becomes equally important. And again, across the spectrum, we have single family homes, we have senior housing, we have traditional apartment homes. Across the spectrum, the needs tend to be the same, and it's that balancing act that Carly described: food insecurity, housing stability, transportation costs, and healthcare. So as those are the other pools on your resources, when you have less resources, you're making much tougher choices. And then that causes, again, this trickle effect of impact on the overall ecosystem of housing. And I would make that same one last call out, is that as we also have not been building enough home ownership opportunities, then as Brent described, people aren't, there's a truncation to our natural housing cycle. So people don't move in out of multifamily into home ownership and then let that rental then naturally be filled. Most people who live in affordable housing live in little a affordable housing, naturally occurring, a spectrum of apartments and houses that are for rent. That's, most people live in that kind of affordable housing, and that's pretty much gone out of in our current environment.
I think something interesting just for the, folks that Leah serves below that 80% AMI, we generally think of that around $50,000 for an individual. To earn that annually working your 40 hours a week, that's a $24 an hour job. So these are, she's talking about our childcare workers who are in that $10 range, but she is servicing folks that are earning up to $24 an hour. And that's really where, Brent, I think as we look at your projects and the mixed use nature of your projects and the fact that you have retail and office tenants that you're working with and, kind of bringing into the community. Can you talk a little bit about, in the last few years, your conversations with your rental tenants or your retail tenants and your office tenants around the need for housing and kind of the mixed use nature of what you're building in the community now?
Yeah, sure. So, mixed use is certainly something we're passionate about. We get the benefits of having the mixed use, and it's beneficial to really all parties involved. And I know when our employers and our mixed use developments are coming, they love the idea of having the housing on site. It creates an ability for a worker to live on site, to work on site. Maybe depending on the type of property they're in or the area they're in, may not need transportation, which is an important piece to this. And I sort of going back to the density portion of it, which will tie in, is that we need the housing where the jobs are. Yes, it's great to have affordable housing out, in the outskirts, but that still requires significant transportation needs, which costs money. And historically, we've been in scenarios where the jobs are is where the housing wasn't allowed. And I'll use Dublin as an example, and a Dublin resident, our business is based here, but historically they have prevented or not allowed dense housing here and segregated their various portions of their businesses and homes in different areas. But that just creates, first of all, larger infrastructure needs, higher infrastructure costs for the city, but also puts a burden on transportation. So I think everybody wins. If employers are happy, employees are happy in their space, and they have time savings from not having to travel. They can walk to grocery stores and shopping, don't have to spend on gas money in the car itself. So I think, yeah, the critical nature of dense mixed use is important. And really the vibrancy that it creates from that, just the walkability of it, and people of all aspects of life are able to sort of come together. And especially if you build the right types of products. Back to the construction cost, it is very expensive to build, and we're trying to deliver the most efficient units we can at the right cost. There are realities we're facing today, but we can do it in different ways, whether it be sizes of units. At least we're addressing in some manner, we're allowing or people have the ability to live in Bridge Park, as an example, at a lower total cost of rent. Yes, it's a smaller unit, but it gives the ability to live here. And in many cases, they can work here, don't need transportation, have access to public, to parks and great amenities that are here without having to travel.
I think that's a really interesting point too, about just the way we've typically kind of segregated and relegated our different uses, in the last half century, and developed our communities that way. The other thing for Central Ohio is we have a very fractured jurisdictional map, right? And there are 43 separate jurisdictions just within Franklin County, including the city of Columbus and a lot of our suburban partners. And Carly, I wanted to know, your work as, working with your membership regionally, can you talk a little bit about that kind of how we as a region come together and how we work with these different jurisdictions to address some of the issues that Brent's identified around, especially density and bringing new housing into our communities?
Yeah, well, and I think it helps to kind of start by pulling that thread that Leah began with on who lives in affordable housing, right? So we know that you need to earn about $20 an hour just to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Most workers don't earn that. 1 out of every 10 of Ohio's most common jobs don't pay in that range. And that was kind of before the inflationary spikes that we're seeing. But we know that affordable housing residents are more likely to work than standard market rate apartment residents. They actually have a 3% higher labor force participation rate. The big difference, though, is that they're working 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 different jobs to be able to cobble those resources together just to pay their living costs. And that is something that affects all of our jurisdictions. That is not a city of Columbus problem. That is not a municipality problem. That is the entire region. And in fact, if you listen to Michael Wilkos, who has amazing data on how population trends are shaping and how our growth is looking, you're seeing that kind of increased suburbanization of poverty. It is moving further and further out. We've known for a long time, I think, as an industry, right? Like the nerds on this call have known what this means for tenants for quite some time. We are just now coming into a renaissance of where we're starting to say, well, what does this mean for everybody else though, right? Like as somebody who feels housing secure, as an employer, what does this mean for me? As a healthcare provider, what is this doing to how my sector operates? A couple months ago, we put a survey out into the field of affordable housing professionals who were also major employers. So they knew the housing side, but they also knew the HR side. And we said, what is this meaning for you? And the results were devastating. I mean, they will shock you, right? So 80% of employers said that their employees show up every day with anxiety and additional mental health barriers because they are experiencing housing instability. And that is affecting their productivity and their morale when they are in the workforce, right? More than half, 53%, said that housing instability, especially evictions, is increasing turnover and it is reducing their workforce stability. So they are having to put more dollars into recruitment, more dollars into training, because when you lose your house, you usually lose your job alongside of it. And then exactly what you and Brett were saying, 40% and this is all specific to Central Ohio, this is all Franklin County, right? 47% said that geospatial mismatch, the fact that all of our affordable housing is over here and all of our entry-level jobs are over here, and that is a 2-hour bus ride to get between those 2 different data points, that is increasing their operational costs. It is reducing turnover, it is reducing morale, it is having, again, that bottom line impact. So when you're thinking about employers, it's not just the ESG department who is having these conversations about affordable housing. It's middle management, it's HR, it's senior management. I mean, this is a bottom line decision that these employers are having to make. I feel like I am probably rambling right now, but I do want to throw out something that is super timely, which is if you checked the dispatch this morning or you checked Business First, who scooped it last night, JP Morgan Chase, in combination with One Columbus and the Workforce Innovation Center, just released a report on what our workforce equity looks like here in the region. And housing was one of the things they cited as a primary barrier to workforce equity. It's an opportunity, I think, for not just employers and for businesses, but for our suburbs to be able to make a claim for how they are serving the people who are already living there and already experiencing these stresses.
Thank you, Carly. And I think as we move into kind of the 21st century, and I think we've talked a little bit about the way we used to kind of separate these uses and separate people. And, as we look at kind of bringing mixed use projects into our communities, but then also, Leah, really thinking back to my big A affordable and little a affordable and our market rate housing and kind of the ways that we've kind of separated those pieces. You have a really interesting project underway in Franklinton, which is a neighborhood that is, seeing increasing housing prices. We're seeing that little a affordability vanish in that community. And you've been able to partner with a market rate developer so that we can bring that big A affordable into the community. And I think, again, that mix of not just uses, but a mix of how we bring housing products into communities. I think it's a really interesting project that I'd like you to talk a little more about.
Thank you, and thank you, Carly, for that lead in, because I'm gonna go where you went, Aaron, and I'm gonna take a little circuitous route to get there. Brent and Carly, when you were mentioning about transportation, so I had a community official out in Licking share with me one day that the cost to the community is bigger than what we realize. So, for example, if you have a 2-hour commute or in a 40-minute commute, then you're not volunteering to run the scout troop. then you're not showing up at a community meeting. You're not civically engaged. You don't have the time. We all have the same amount of hours in the day, right? Like, and so if you have to prioritize them to spend traveling to where jobs are or vice versa, then you're not going to engage in the community in the ways that we really think, to be well-rounded community. We have citizens with diverse backgrounds that are participating. You just don't have that. And so I think we haven't counted the cost of the way that our development patterns have worked and who they are or are not disadvantaging, as well as who they're benefiting. And I think that shows up. And then when we have a conversation at a zoning committee, who are the people that can participate at a zoning committee? Like, there may not be the voices that are more diverse or inclusive of this attitude around development and density and development patterns. And I can't discount that obviously our cities in Ohio, this is how they're funded. They are funded by income taxes, not real estate taxes. So we can't discount and disconnect those two things. So being able to really understand how the intersections work and advance an overall strong community. I ask a lot of people, as a planning nerd, I ask a lot of people, like, what do you think is an ideal community, right? And usually people will say mixed income, mixed types of housing, mixed use, walkability. So what neighborhoods do you get that in is typically you have that differing types of housing, differing types of commercial and office spaces, and you don't have as blank and homogeneous a development pattern as you were referencing, Aaron. We got to this place where we separate all the uses. Single family houses are here, multifamily are here, industries here. We've done that, but that's not actually how many people want to live. And so I circle all that back around to Franklinton, which, if you're familiar with Columbus history, the oldest neighborhood in Central Ohio, and how it saw itself going to this space where it was just being tremendous development opportunities were happening in the market rate space on the residential side, and you weren't seeing that corresponding growth of affordability. And so our partnership with Kaufman gets, again, back to this density conversation. If we have a small site that we maybe could do a development on, for us, that's about 50 apartments, but there was no way we were going to be able to park it. So, meanwhile, Kaufman has this overall development plan that could include parking in their building for our residents, some corresponding services between the two properties where they have the mixed use, they have offices, they have residential, and then you add our residential piece to it. So it's every part of the ecosystem doing the part that they can. So they're not going to come over here and do this building where we have a particular service model, we have a particular property management model. We know what to do to make that project work, but we can partner together so that we're both doing what we have expertise in, but it overall collectively addresses the community need. So when we start with what does the community need, they need a housing, but they need housing at different income levels. We often say, well, this was a neighborhood where the principal of the school lived, the teacher of the school lived, and the janitor of the school lived. Well, they didn't all live in the same house. They lived in different types of housing that were maybe all in proximity to each other. And when we see that in mixed income communities, then you don't have people as segregated by income. People may segregate by interest. So now you might go to this church, or you might like to go to the Y to work out, or you might do this. So we see people segregate by interest more than we see people segregate by income or class in that scenario, which again gives you a more vibrant and long-term sustainable community. Because what happens when you do have, quote unquote, all your eggs in one basket, then if something happens to that industry or that sector, usually in the business, in the economic development world, you want a diversity of business types that is supporting your community. Well, that takes a diversity of workers and employees that are going to support that diversity of businesses. And you're not going to want to have one industry that you only have workers in case of that, there's a fluctuation in any one business. So I think collectively, the Kaufman team, it was very interested in the whole ecosystem of the neighborhood, not just the one development site. And that's why it was a great partnership for us to work with them. And, we do partnerships in different ways, whereby, again, our expertise is in one space, and we partner with those that have expertise in others, whether that be, might be, a lot of our peers do work where there's childcare in their building, or there's a grocery store in their house, in their mixed use. They love more mixed use work type that. But I think that when we can let down the who has to win in the negotiation, that if we're all winning, we're all advancing the part that is most important for us, then we can have more impactful partnerships that do that.
This has been a really fantastic conversation about just kind of what our region's facing around housing affordability. But I know the chamber, kind of the second half of the title of this government spotlight was around the role of the business community, right? And thinking about the role that you all play in our community and addressing housing. And I know, Brent, you at the beginning of this conversation talked a little bit about the challenges to just getting developments approved, right? And historically, those conversations have been dominated by neighbors and homeowners and residents. But I think we all know we're going to need to build a bigger table if we're going to move the needle and really have a broader conversation about the impacts of the lack of housing that we have. So Brent, I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about, the role of the business community in working towards bringing those projects out of the ground.
Yeah, sure. A little bit to what I said before. I mean, the business community is just one aspect, right? None of this happens without everybody working together. And I use the example, the short north is certainly one, whether depending on which side of the street you want to talk about. There was a number of developments down there, and I think Kaufman was one, and I think it took him ultimately 3+ years to get approved to build his development. So you're taking off units that would have been online there 3 years sooner. And at the same time, the cost to get those units online because of 3 years of delays and architecture fees and everything else, all of those things cost money, which drive rents up. Our process in Columbus, and I'm not saying Columbus proper in general, just in Ohio even, to get things approved from a zoning perspective and a final approval to break ground is so onerous, and it costs so much money. It just continues to force the rents up higher and higher there. So I think the attitude again has to be from everybody that we're all going to participate in this by allowing this density and zoning. And I think also this perception that, and I hear it a lot even in responses is, greedy developers. It's not about greedy developers. We want to build affordable housing, but I think it's an education process about how housing gets built, how it gets paid for, and how it's funded. And in our case, we have to attract lenders, right? Lenders have to agree to let us borrow the money to build projects that work. We have to attract capital that makes it work. And so how do we build a system in which our units are less expensive to attract capital to build more units? And I know the city, certainly city officials and government officials know that we need the housing, but we need to have the will to do it. And the will is simply to step out of the way and let the density happen. Because I can sit here today and safely say it's only going to get significantly worse than it is today. Back to all the original comments, supply and demand is the driver. Until our supply outstrips demand, we're never going to be in an improved situation. And with Intel and others moving here, Columbus is an amazing city. We have so many people moving here and so many jobs. My goodness sakes, it's only going to get worse unless there's a collective will to do it. The people say the words a lot, but we just haven't seen the action necessary to do it. And it's all the way to parking requirements that prevent us from being able to build because we're required so many parking spots. Well, the idea is we want to build where parking isn't necessary, so where the jobs are. There's just so many different ways to go about it. There's sort of an onslaught against development in a way, while in one side and the other side saying we need additional housing, tax abatements. People hate the word tax abatements. The reality is these deals in today's market don't work without them. It should be looked at as, hey, let's get these built to lower the cost of housing. The abatements wear off, then it will fund the schools. It's a win all the way around. So we're very passionate about it, as you might be able to tell. And it's frustrating that there are solutions that are available right now today. We could literally start today and making improvements. But if we don't start today, even starting today, it's going to take us 18 months just to see the first benefits of it. So we need to take action immediately.
I think that's really an important component of it is, we've really relied on our competitiveness around our livability and our affordability, right? And, as we look at how companies are coming in, there was a podcast I was listening to about Dallas, and there was an economic development official that said, 10 years ago, he almost always dealt with the accountants, right? It was what was the cost of doing business in this community. And he's like, really recently, it's been almost exclusively HR. Right? What is the lifestyle that I can bring my workers? What is the place that they are going to be living? And right now, Columbus is a very livable place, right? And it is an affordable place. But as we continue to not meet the need on the housing production, we will face a future where that livability and affordability is not part of what we bring to the table for employers. And we're seeing our peer cities are experiencing some of that disinvestment and certainly lack of companies wanting to go into those communities, right? And we have this very unique position where we can do things differently and learn from our peer cities, and hopefully shift that trajectory. And so, Leah, I want to ask you the kind of a similar question. How is the business community able to support the work that you do, and ways in which they can help escalate the housing that you're bringing into the community?
Yeah, I think Brent makes a really good point. Even for, again, us, when we bring a project forward, the resistance is the same, and it may have come in different wrapping, but it's the same kind of resistance. And I often say, like, there's no other market-based business where you get to opine on what they're going to do. Like, I don't get to tell Pepsi how to make Pepsi, right? But you get to tell Brent, and you get to tell me, well, you can't build that, you got to build this, right? Like, so there's this forum that we've created that immediately makes development and community adversaries. And we have to figure out, how do we reset that, so that we actually are advancing, just like he said, people want housing. We know that that's out there. We know there's a market for what we do. How do we actually get that voice to be a part of the development process and be informing the development process? And I think that's what the business community can help, is that when you have, as we said, cities run on income taxes. So when you have a business that says, hey, I need this kind of housing, it's supporting the workers and employees that I'm wanting to attract and that are going to help my business run. Like, there's a voice there. There's some authority there that brings to the table and brings to the conversation, and maybe helps shift it off of, I live next door to this site and I don't want it to be anything but trees, right? Like that, that's the voice that's louder in our development conversations. And if we can shift it to again, what that overall benefit, and it doesn't discount, because I don't think any of our developments, even on a tax credit environment, they do not reduce property taxes, property values, they do not increase crime. Those are all perceptions that we can continue to navigate, and insensitive to that. We're talking about change. Anytime we're doing a development project, we're taking people through a change cycle, right? We're dealing with change management, and being able to get people to count the benefits of the change and not the cost of what they're going to think they lose. So I would say again that business community support can obviously come in many ways. If you have a piece of land, call me. So there's always that. But alternatively, there's a voice that the business community has that could effectively advance some of the social, civic, and policy making that happens at the government and community level, that really does create an environment and an economic ecosystem that is sustainable and long-term beneficial. And I do think, one of the things that, Aaron and I've talked about, and the MORPC housing study talks about, is advancing equity. There's a cost if we do not advance equity. And so when you continue to let this divide happen in our community, we will pay a longer term cost. It's hard to quantify that for people as we sit here in 2022, what the impacts would be for 2030 or 2035. But we know that with these gaps, we would be essentially harming the foundation of what's allowed us to grow and be strong for the past several decades.
Thank you, Leah. And I think I want to save the last 10 minutes. I think we have a number of questions that are coming through on the chat, but Carly, wanting to kind of end on an optimistic note, and I know you had a member at the end of last year that had a letter to the editor in the Dispatch, and really making the claim that we as Central Ohio can be the first region to get this right and to actually solve this conundrum that we're all facing as a community. So I kind of want to just leave it with you to kind of have that conversation about the optimism for us in Central Ohio to actually get this right.
Yeah, I'm good for the optimistic note, because totally 100%. We can do this. We can be the first city to solve the affordable housing crisis. We can also be the first city to unlock what equitable economic growth looks like, right? And there's so many things that are working in our favor, right? And our community is already mobilized. We have people in conversations like this that are happening every day. Our elected officials get it. The fact, Aaron, that your position exists, that the mayor has stood up and said affordable housing is priority number one for us. There's so many cities that are not at that cognition point yet. We are outpacing them by far, and we've got capacity out the wazoo. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but from an industry sector, Central Ohio is a hub for affordable housing innovation. Some of the nation's top companies are headquartered here. They've learned what works and what doesn't in all of these other markets in the country, and they want to bring that knowledge home and make us the landing point. All of that is great. As far as those on the call today, what you can do right now to help us move closer there. Low hanging fruit, right? We just launched a program called Resiliency Bridge. We talked to employees, they were making 9, 10, 11 bucks an hour. And we said, what is it going to take to get you to a place where you're stabilized, where you don't need affordable housing? What is the bridge that is going to get you to that point in your life? And they said, well, I need a workforce certification. Great at my job, put in 60 hours a week, but without that piece of paper, I'm never going to get up the ladder. So we said, okay, we will pay for your housing while you go through that certification. We'll pay for your utility costs. We'll make sure that you have childcare. We'll make sure that all of these different support structures are in place, because if we can make that investment in your growth for the next 12, 15 months, you will go on after that. So if you're an employer on this call and you've got that frontline worker who you know is great, but they don't yet have the skill set to move up the ladder, send them to Resiliency Bridge. I mean, that is a great partnership and we can help each other. As far as advocacy, and I'm seeing so much activity in the chat about setting priorities, working together as a community. I'll note that the Ohio Chamber of Commerce just became the latest signer to the Coalition on Housing and Homelessness advocacy request to the state of Ohio, to the General Assembly, to the governor's office, to set aside $300 million of their state and local recovery funds for affordable housing investment. Sign the letter, right? We've got similar initiatives here locally. I'm out of respect to Aaron and our excellent moderator, I'm not going to turn this into a pitch, but those opportunities exist at every level. And suburban communities as well. This isn't Central City alone. We mentioned that those communities for too long have been too exclusive, that people are not able to exercise choice in where they live. Source of income ordinances are a great way to start busting down those barriers. Not a silver bullet, not going to solve it all in one fell swoop, but it is that great incremental step. And we've already had 6 of our jurisdictions here in Central Ohio adopt that ordinance. We've also now added Reynoldsburg, who expanded to include a pay to stay, which is an eviction prevention technique. All of these are things that we can do now, and then in the next 2 to 3 years, zoning is going to be front and center. And this is like the capstone of what we've talked about. Our land use rules no longer match what our people want and what they need. So we can reset those scales and we can now achieve what this region deserves. And just getting involved in that conversation, showing up at a public hearing. Yeah, they're probably going to be on Tuesday at 7:30 and there's going to be no food and no childcare, but we can work on that while making sure that we have a voice in what our community looks like. So opportunities abound, optimistic through the roof.
Thanks, Carly. I think that was, certainly our region is facing a lot of things that we collectively need to address, but the belief in this community, I think, is also equally as strong, that we can be the place that makes the changes we need and welcomes our new neighbors and makes it a place that continues to be livable and affordable and competitive. I'm going to hand it back to Des, who I think has been watching the chat and may have some folks that have some questions for our panelists as well.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. I do have one question that is listed here and want to elaborate on that question, but how can we encourage and legislate additional public taxpayer dollars to subsidize affordable housing? Can you speak to the importance of the private-public partnership moving forward?
So, is that for me?
That's for anyone that would like to answer.
I could take it. Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly a lot of the things that we've gotten done to this point are because of the public-private partnership. I think a lot of it requires, and I'm going to use the Worthington. I saw somebody was from Worthington on there about the, you're familiar with a site in Worthington that I believe Lifestyle is trying to get zoned for 6 or 7 years, housing that could have been built. And the public-private piece that comes in is that so much, and somebody mentioned earlier, you've got your couple neighbors that are fighting against it because they don't want it in their backyard. It was okay probably, for them to move in somebody else's backyard at the time, but people get to the point where it's like, well, now not mine. Now's when we're going to stop. And this public-private partnership is everybody has to sort of understand the give and take there. And we need to, to have the city step up and say, we know what's best for our community. And unfortunately, you can't let individuals drive whether we have housing success in Columbus, Ohio. And that is a lot of what's happened. There have been many deals that have been killed that could have provided hundreds of units. And that's just a great example where a few neighbors got together. And now I think they're on 7 or 8 years of fighting. And I think there was a federal lawsuit just filed against that. So we have to work together on the public-private side. And we were fortunate enough here in Dublin to be able to work directly with them to say, what kind of housing do you want? They had really come full circle to say, we now recognize that we don't have the right housing in Dublin, Ohio. We can't solely live on $1 million homes and survive long term. And so allow this dense housing. The communities, the cities really have to work with the residents and also push the residents and sometimes make decisions that they think are best for their community and not just for 2 or 3 homeowners.
So I'll jump in, Des, and just add that the thing that I think would help is that if we say we have a toolbox, that every tool isn't going to do everything. So the tax abatement is the right in one situation, actual dollars to subsidize the development is right in another situation, changing the zoning is right in another situation. I think we have to think again that if it's a toolbox, then we're gonna have tools that activate and advance housing in different ways at different points, and being able to activate those tools in the right way. Maybe again in the gravity and Homeport situation, the city's funds went into the garage that our residents are going to park at across the street. So that, that's a different kind of support that's going to advance our project getting done. So I do think that if we keep our mind open and don't think every project is going to get every project has to be done in the same way, that there are a lot of ways with if there's land or if there's some other resources that can be brought to it, that's going to help impact and advance the housing development and the actual outcomes that we want to have.
And if I can throw into all of that through and through, I think that a lot of this really comes down to education and just knocking down the myths that are out there, because so much of this NIMBY is rooted in things that are patently, objectively, demonstrably false, right? So we hear people oppose affordable housing because it's going to lower my property values. True. In fact, in most cases, affordable housing increases the value of property next to it because it takes a vacant, blighted, ugly piece of land and turns it into something productive that people want. We hear affordable housing will increase crime. Not even remotely true. In fact, it reduces crime. It puts more eyeballs on the street, both violent crime and property crime. It is a net good for our community. But if we're constantly working against a false narrative, it's going to be an uphill battle. So we got to get people more engaged in the truth.
Thank you for that. And Charlie, this is directly for you. You had mentioned several companies based in Central Ohio that are innovating in affordable housing. Could you please provide some examples?
So Leah and Homeport and the work in Easton and the work in Reynoldsburg, I mean, I can name 60 million different developments, but I will let Leah toot her own horn. Outside of them though, there's lots. So national church residences, national level nonprofit, really intentional about linking housing and healthcare for seniors and having campus style investments where you can have a dental appointment, you can, have on-site services. And they've made over $50 million worth of housing investments in the Northland neighborhood alone. I mean, not any of the other work that they're doing in the city and the county as a whole, but just in Northland, it's 50 million. Woda Cooper, excellent organization, also headquartered here in city of Columbus. Their Livingston project just won an Edison Award. It's one of the most coveted awards in affordable housing nationally for the super cool adaptive reuse of this Art Deco building. So it really shows that housing doesn't take away from the community, it enhances what's there. One last one, national, Career Gateway, the residences at Career Gateway is a partnership between Nationwide Children's Hospital and NRP and a community development for all people that very intentionally links workforce development and housing. It has an on-site training academy where people can learn workforce skills, and then it's got a direct feeder pipeline right into the hospital's hiring system. None of that stuff is happening. Like Columbus is pioneering all of that.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you, Charlie, for that. Certainly appreciate that in your answer. This question is directed towards Brent. Brent, how can we attract more local developers to build affordable housing?
Great question. We're fortunate in Columbus, at least as it relates to just the sheer volume of developers. When you compare us to say Cleveland or Cincinnati, we have a lot of local developers and national developers. So we certainly have the scale to do it. I think one thing, even sitting here on the call, thinking that, it's probably time we all get together as developers and say, what are the influences that we could have to help influence policy? We all do it individually, I think, to really push and try to push for the density. But I think it's us working together. I can tell you, Don, that there's, I just had drinks with a friendly developer competitor, but we're all friendly in the business, and we talked about affordable housing. This was just on Monday night about what we can do, but talking about some of the frustrations that exist there. Like, we have the will, the ability, the time, the staff, the teams to do it, but there are so many barriers placed in front of us. And so just sitting here thinking that, it's probably time for us to band together to think that how do we put our influence here, because we have a lot of development potential here in Columbus.
Good deal. Thank you, Brent. There was a question directed towards Spectrum, but the Spectrum representative is not here at this time, but that is a really good question. I will reach out to them to ask them about, excuse me, the affordability of some of their services to ensure folks in certain demographics can continue to live in their homes and also pay for those types of amenities. But we have another question for you, Brent. As it relates to, and this actually could go for anyone on the panel, can we require both commercial and residential builders to provide a percentage of their housing units to be affordable housing?
You can.
And you can.
Yeah, certainly those attempts have been made. At the end of the day, though, we still have to have something that can work financially, and that can be solved again by density. So if we had a building that was going to be 5 stories tall and you said 2 stories had to be affordable housing, might be very difficult to work. But if you said it can be 20 stories tall and 3 of those could be affordable housing, then it probably works. Or as an example, that's where those policy changes can really impact and make it affordable. At the end of the day, we want to do it. We want to build affordable housing. It makes sense. All the things we just talked about are great for Columbus. It's great for our citizens. It's great for us as a company and a community. But we have to have the financial ability to do it. That's the world we live in, that we have to be able to attract capital here. So I think that's just a really important piece. I just want to mention quickly is trying to get the education piece of this is so critical. Not everybody's on the same page, right? So I just, there was an initiative just recently announced about capping rental rates in Columbus, Ohio. And if we want to see something that would absolutely devastate our housing in Columbus, Ohio, it would be to put caps on rates. And that would simply be because we wouldn't be able to develop any longer. The ability to attract capital, both loans and new capital to Columbus, would cease immediately. Property values would drop significantly on existing. So there'd be little to no incentive to build new developments here. And you would have a housing crisis of epic proportions if that were to pass coming up here that's on this new initiative.
So can I just offer a couple of things? There are communities across our country who have tried inclusionary zoning. So that's the phrase that people usually use for that requirement of affordability. They have not seen it significantly improve or increase the amount of affordable housing developed because of some of the reasons that Brent said. But I think it's because what are you really actually trying to do? So in that scenario, you're trying to force an activity that the market is not doing. And that doesn't address all of the barriers to that activity actually happening in the market. So I think it's a limited approach that doesn't get to the heart of the impact that a community was going to want to see by enforcing that. That's kind of maybe this last grasp effort. And again, as Carly described, we have the opportunity to have strategies, investments, and policies that actually creates an environment where the housing is getting built, not by a requirement that would or would not be successful, but because it actually is a market imperative and it is actually working in the marketplace. So I think, to go there is not necessarily going to give us the impact and response that we want as we think about how it's worked in other communities.
The phrase I think about is unfunded mandate, right? You can't ignore the fact that there are very real financial challenges to creating affordable housing. Just saying you shall do it without recognizing those barriers, it could be problematic.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, there are certain deals even that we've looked at, and we have some now, where there are some mandates essentially on the amount of affordable housing that's there. And it's at this point prevented us from being able to start the housing at all. And so instead of, yes, we're not delivering maybe the 20 affordable housing units, but also left off the other 150 units I talked about in my initial statement, which is we need housing in general right now. What a lot of the policies are restricting housing altogether. And that's, you know, it's a double whammy, both from the top and the bottom.
Gotcha. Well, hey, thank you all for your answers on that question. Certainly appreciate it, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I'd like to close out. Aaron, our panelists, do you all have anything else to add before we close out?
Just again, appreciate the chamber for hosting this conversation. I mean, to Carly's point, we are a city that is talking about this early, far earlier than a lot of our peer cities did. And for them to unwind the damage that was done by not facing what they were facing, that has been a really big challenge that I think we as Central Ohio, conversations like this indicate we're taking a different path. So I appreciate the chamber's willingness to host this conversation. And thank you for the panelists and the expertise and perspective that they brought to this conversation.
Certainly. Thank you, Aaron. So in closing, I'll go ahead and close out. Again, thank you to our moderator and our panelists for their knowledge and participation in this morning's Government Spotlight program. If you enjoyed today's program and would like to revisit the conversation at a later date, be sure to keep an eye out on your email. You should receive a link to the recorded program within the next 24 hours. On behalf of the Columbus Chamber, we want to thank you for supporting Government Series Spotlight. We look forward to providing relevant and insightful programming for you in the future. Please be sure to visit the Chamber's website at columbus.org/events, and that's /events for more events like this in the future. We hope to see you all soon again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
It was awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Amazing.